On August 12th, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act as the government's biggest investment in climate change mitigation ever. This marks an important milestone here in the US and inspires renewed hope in our ability to make real progress towards our climate goals for 2030 and beyond. I'm Stephanie Miller, Director of Public Relations for HOK, and with me today is Annika Landrino, HOK's Global Director of Sustainability, and Greg Katz, the founder and CEO of the Smart Surfaces Coalition. In addition to her work with HOK, Annika serves on the Washington, D.C. Green Construction and Energy Technical Advisory Group, the D.C. Mayor's Green Building Advisory Council, the National USGBC Lead Advisory Committee, the IECC 2024 Code Development Committee, and is a senior fellow of the New Buildings Institute, who also testified before the House of Representatives on many of the issues that are included in the Inflation Reduction Act and that we're going to talk about today. Greg is an honorary member of the AIA, a longtime thought leader and investor in the transition to a low-carbon economy. In addition to founding the Smart Surfaces Coalition, he's held leadership positions at a global clean energy private equity venture capital fund and with the U.S. Department of Energy, among other important roles. So over the next 20 to 30 minutes, we're going to explore the potential impact of this new legislation on the built environment, design, engineering, real estate, construction, materials, and more. We invite everyone to leave questions in the comment section, and we will incorporate them in the conversation as we are able, or we will respond once the conversation is complete. And the conversation will stay visible on LinkedIn, so you can follow up as the discussion ends. But let's dive in. There's a lot to talk about. Annika, broadly speaking, what is the potential impact of this new legislation on the AEC industry, both in the short and the long term?
Thank you. Well, I think we're seeing a huge movement towards adopting the latest energy codes. There was underlying funding in the infrastructure bill, $225 million. That's been compounded with another $330 million to adopt the 2021 energy codes, as well as $670 million to encourage jurisdictions, states to adopt zero energy or zero carbon stretch codes. So last time we saw this kind of investment, and it wasn't nearly this magnitude, in code adoption was in the 2009 stimulus bill. And that is what brought most of the country up to the 2009 energy code. So there was a transformative shift as a result of that. And here we have, over $1 billion in energy code investment, really exciting stuff to see. Competitive grants for states to apply. So for new construction, I think we're going to see a big shift across the country. Of course, model codes are updated every 3 years, but states adopt the model codes at their own pace. And you have some states with no state level model code adoption that just allow local jurisdictions, but you have many that adopt every 6 years or 9 years or even 10, 12 years. As the funding and resources become available. So this is a huge investment in providing those resources. So we'll see a huge lift for new construction. There's also a lot of signals around existing buildings. Things like just removing, competition between LIHTC tax credits for low-income housing, from the energy efficiency tax credits that you used to have to, one or the other, you couldn't compound these, and now these are additive or stackable incentives, things like the 179D tax credit for commercial buildings, that if you're an existing building, your reductions have to be against your own history of energy performance, not against the current, ASHRAE 90.1 standard. So we're seeing this great package of incentives around doing energy audits, weatherization, swapping out, systems, components, pieces of equipment, or making improvements to the building envelope. And so that's very exciting to see for existing buildings. We've worked on some deep green retrofits in Washington, D.C., brought them up to the level of new construction in terms of performance and transformed them into Class A office buildings for less than half the time or cost of new construction. So when you couple that with these incentives, I think we'll see a huge boom in existing building investment. There's additional incentives for the federal government to invest in their own portfolio, new and existing. And there's incentives specifically targeted at electrification and that idea that as we decarbonize the grid, we also move away from fossil fuel combustion. So I think near term, we'll see a lot of activity around code adoption. Long term, we're moving really rapidly towards that decarbonization of the built environment we know we need to get to meet the Paris Accord.
Well, then that seems like a great opportunity to transition to, Greg, some of your experience and expertise. How might the funding associated with this legislation spur the construction industry to take what some might say is a really overdue leap forward? Do you expect it to inspire innovation in building materials, in embodied carbon reduction? Where do you see this potentially leading us from a materials innovation perspective?
Yeah, I do. It's great to be on with you. I agree with Annika. I think it's a milestone bill. The timing's really important. I think there's been a majority of the industry, majority of building owners, majority of users have sort of said, well, let's wait and see. We could start to do some minor things, but this transition we know is going to happen. So you have this combination of an extraordinarily hot summer, thousands of, you know, uh, peak heat experiences, thousands of excess heat deaths this summer in combination with this bill in the middle of August at the kind of toward the end of one of the hottest summers on record. And that combination, I think, for a lot of people who've been sitting on the fence, is going to be transformative. Everybody looks at this and says, we know we have to do a transition to low carbon. We know climate change is real. The question is when. And for a lot of people sitting on the fence, combination of the sort of push on the extreme heat experience accelerating in combination with substantial funding to support that acceleration in terms of innovation of new technologies. As Annika said, adoption of much more aggressive codes, specific funding, for example, $2 billion in GSA to adopt low carbon, negative carbon materials, quite a lot of funding for low income, targeted low income, helping those communities that have much higher energy bills, less efficient buildings, making that transition. State energy office, very efficient vehicle through a $4.3 billion grant funding, challenge grant funding that they're going to be providing. So all these different components add up. But I think the large picture for me is that the rationale for waiting has largely gone away, and that IRA provides the funding to enable this transition from sort of sitting on a fence or doing relatively little to really diving in and going to zero net carbon. And I think people will look back at this as kind of a milestone summer because of the combination of the heat and this bill.
And just a question, not to put you on the spot, but your comment made me think of it. Are there any particular materials that you would be most excited to see that you think with this push maybe will get brought to the fore that might seem more like science fiction, or because of those issues of time or funding were maybe a nice to have, but do you think is there just one thing that you'd be excited to really see come to the fore from
I
a
think
materials perspective?
probably two things. One would be ground source heat pumps. They're a no brainer. They cut your energy heating and cooling bill by about half, and they reduce the risk. They're very cost effective as they scale up. Both the cost of sourcing the product materials, the installation, and the maintenance costs are coming down. There's a lot of funding that can be applied to that. So that one technology is going to be extraordinarily important. The other one is low carbon or carbon sequestering material, and that would include flue stack gas being turned into aggregate by a whole range of companies doing low and negative carbon concrete, such as Blue Planet in California. That product's actually been specified and used in the airport in San Francisco. So you think about concrete as 7 or 8% of the world's CO2. Because so much of it is produced, it probably will end up being the primary place that we sequester carbon out of flue stack gas, both in power plants and industrial plants. And I think that this bill is going to accelerate both of those technologies adoption a lot.
Great, thank you. And Aniko, you were mentioning before we even hopped on the call that some aspects of this bill may not immediately appear connected to the built environment, but will have an impact. Could you speak to some of those that you were thinking of?
Yeah, there's a lot outside of just electric in and energy efficient appliances. There's a lot out there to incentivize comprehensive investment in our electric grid across the country. You know, we've seen these, as Greg mentioned, increase in severe events, prolonged heat. I think there were something like 60 days in a row over 100 degrees in Texas. And just a year after they had that deep freeze, which compromised their grid, both extremes compromise their grid. And we're seeing those challenges reflected around the country with our extremes. And so, this investment in our utility infrastructure, specifically around electric utility, it's not just in its own standalone component of the bill, it's also in the ag bill, because we see a lot of our wind farms and even ground mounted solar being a co investment in our agricultural Midwest and plains, the Great Plains of the United States. So it's an additional revenue stream. There's investment in forestry, including urban forests, which can help with resiliency and heat island mitigation, air quality, all kinds of co-benefits. But also in investigating some of our forest or ag byproducts to use for low carbon building materials. So these investments, whether it's carbon sequestering concrete, looking at additional crop sources for mass timber or mass ag type structural building materials. These are investments that are of the size, the scale really needed to, jumpstart this industry to really help innovators take their product to market and to try some projects at scale. So having this huge source for federal buildings to actually try low carbon materials is enormous. There's nearly $1 billion for the federal government to try out and demonstrate these low carbon technologies and materials, which is really important. Many years ago, we worked on a deep green retrofit of the Byron Rogers Federal Building in Denver, and at that time, LED lighting was nascent. People were using it maybe in their building lobbies, places it was hard to change light bulbs. So the idea of a long life was appealing, but they weren't sure that they could do it at scale. And so at that time, the Green Proving Ground was that GSA had launched was transformative in proving that you could take a huge, commercial office building and you could use that technology and it was effective and it would work. And once you do it on a project of that scale, then it de-risks it for the rest of the market. They're not the first to stick their head out. So the idea that there's all this seed funding for companies to both innovate but also to do installations that demonstrate that they are effective, that they work, that we can trust putting them in our buildings, that they will perform. That is huge. So in addition to electrification, in addition to some of the forestry and ag investments, we're also seeing some regulations around methane emissions. And I think all of these coupled up are sending signals to the market. Methane, of course, fugitive methane leaks are a byproduct of natural gas infrastructure in our communities. And I'm working with the District of Columbia as other jurisdictions are working on electrification building codes. And so I think we're sending a signal here with this choice of where we invest. It's not a ban on anything, it's just here's what we're investing in. And we're investing in things that are signaling electrification is going to be the way of the future. So as we add more renewables to the grid, which will be more reliable because we're investing in the grid, as we're regulating methane and putting some caps on that, I think we're saying you can trust the electrical grid. We're going to put more clean energy on it, and we're going to de-incentivize natural gas.
That's great. And it kind of led to one of the other questions that we were going to talk about that you touched on. It's what is that relationship between the government and the public sector and the private? And you talked a little bit about what you saw the impact could be with the GSA. Greg, because your experience also is on both sides of the private and the public, is there anything else you wanted to mention around that, the influence that public spending could have on the private sector?
Yeah, it's a great question. The strength of the bill is that it's very broad, uh, and it includes important features like very strong preferences for registered apprentice programs because a lot of job creation is going to happen because of this. And the apprentice part of this, which is incented, is going to mean a lot of people who may not have jobs or want to move from the jobs they're in can get into a better job track with a managed pathway. So that, in terms of social transformation and the ability to sort of leverage this transition to have a more inclusionary, broad-based uh, employment is really important. The many different elements can be a bit confusing because there's so much there. And so I think one of the challenges is going to be how do you make sure that sort of the larger opportunities are not missed? And this is where the federal government, the public government becomes so important. So if you think about low income communities in cities, you're looking at about 50 million people, mostly minority. Because of the surfaces we put on, they're about 12 to 15 degrees hotter in the summer than wealthy communities. And that means their energy bills are much higher. The air conditioning can't keep up. That's where you get all these heat deaths. You have heat events now that kill thousands of people, even 50,000 people in Europe in one heat event. Chicago, which is a northern city, at 800 heat deaths. So the importance for this, I think, is as people deploy this bill, is to think not about slices but transitions. And that transition has to include incorporating all of these different elements, right? The solar, we talked about energy efficiency, more reflective roofs, trees, bioswales. How do you manage sun and rain, these two gifts that God gives us in our cities, which right now we turn that into heat we don't want and flooding that hurts us. And that's just dumb policy. So what we're supporting on the Smart Surface Coalition is cities adopting all these in an integrated way. And cities have a very powerful role in doing that and a powerful incentive. So, for example, Baltimore, 7% of the employment is tourism. It's critical for city revenue. They're adopting smart surfaces, so reflective, porous, and green surfaces, PV, and trees citywide. We project a 5-degree cooling in downtown and about a 7-degree cooling in low income neighborhoods. So it's important that as these pieces get deployed, they get deployed in a way that's integrated, and federal government, state government, cities have the ability to make sure that these elements get woven together into a much larger picture. And that picture needs to be a transition away from enormous discrepancy in quality of life, in temperature, in flooding, in low income and minority areas compared to wealthy areas. That is a long-standing structural environmental injustice problem that's a direct result of city investment in services, or not investing in surfaces, not investing in solar, not investing in trees, not investing in efficiency in low income areas. This bill can transform that. But it's important that the public entities involved in managing that do so in a way that's holistic and kind of looks at the bigger opportunity of reshaping all those surfaces in an integrated way. So to give one example, you have a more reflective roof and you have trees that shade. What does that do? Well, you're reducing the ambient temperature in Baltimore by 5 degrees, plus the shading. And now you're bringing down your peak electricity by 30 to 40%. And for many people who can't afford air conditioning, that's a very big difference and can make the difference literally between life and death. So, the role of the public sector here in taking this incredible new funding package with all its elements and using it to drive a transformation in surfaces and redressing long term structural inequality that is really racially based is going to be an important opportunity for public sector to keep its eye on and to focus on.
And that we can all, as part of the built environment world, be greater advocates for and to help all of our clients understand that, and our communities beyond even just our clients.
If I
We,
could just,
yeah, jump in on
yeah,
that.
chime in, because I think Greg mentioned a really important component of the bill. A lot of the tax incentives have compounding benefits if you buy American, if you're buying products or materials that at least 55% were made in the U.S. And then another compounding, benefit if there's you meet certain wage thresholds for the employees of the companies that you're buying from or that are doing the work. And so I think it's really important to note that there's that incentive is moving people towards buying American-made products and materials, as well as paying people a livable wage. So when we talk about transformation socially and equitably, that is around wealth building, and not billionaire wealth building, but bringing people up to a living standard that provides them with the ability to turn on their AC in the summer, or to buy healthy food to eat, to put good clothes on their kids when they send them off to school. And concurrently with this, when we're investing in these energy efficiency retrofits for people's homes or businesses or schools, it's not just about energy, and it's not just about climate impacts. We're reducing thermal shock, we're reducing air quality hazards that they may have, providing them with better indoor air quality, better comfort, better resiliency. If the grid does fail or falter, they can stay in their homes longer without being displaced. And of course, we're lowering their energy burden. Low-income families in the United States sometimes pay 40% or more of their income towards their utility bills. So if we can bring that down, that gives them more to spend on other things they need, like food or medicine. And so that compounding effect, both on the stimulus side, the incentive side, as well as the co-benefits of the work that it encourages, really have the power to be transformative in our communities.
Add to what Annika said, I mean, RFF's projections are that this will result in 5 to 7% reduction in average utility bills for homeowners. So this is a strategy. We always have known that energy efficiency is very cost effective, and what's this kind of combination of strengthening jobs, training, making communities and businesses more competitive by reducing energy bills, helping the U.S. get ahead on innovation, so we're the ones exporting to the world rather than to have an import. And you do it at the same time while cutting at people's energy bills. That's a really fantastic combination. I don't see how anybody can oppose it who's a business person or cares about quality of life in cities.
Well, I get the sense that we could spend the next 5 hours unpacking this and continuing to talk, but it feels like that just kind of was a nice resting point. Maybe we'll organize a second round of this conversation, but this has been a great start. Thank you both. Um, so, everyone, if you have additional questions, please drop them in the comment section. I encourage you, if you don't already, follow both Greg and Annika on LinkedIn, because they surely will be continuing the conversation on their own accounts. And this conversation, as I mentioned, will be on our LinkedIn account for a while. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Annika.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Stephanie.